All right, next up we've got David Ferreira, also known as CG Monkey King. Hey, David.
Hey, Christopher.
So give us a little background on yourself.
Okay, so I was born in a small village in Portugal called Nazaré that has now become very famous due to the gigantic waves we got there. I went to college and studied biology. I actually graduated in biology, but then I decided I wanted to do something else, so I went to architecture. And along the course of architecture, I met 3ds Max and the world of CG. And I started making some money based on using those tools. So I dropped the architecture course, and decided to go all into the CG. Eventually, I got a job at an archivist studio called Archi 300. I stayed there for a couple of years, and then I went out to be able to grab different types of jobs that I wanted to experiment with, and became a freelancer for a really long time. And I'm now currently working as an effects 2D and a generalist at Macavision in Stuttgart. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. So what's your presentation going to be on today?
So the presentation is going to be based on a personal work that I did a while back. The work is called Liquid Particles, and the concept behind that work, and it's actually the title for the presentation, is Paintings in Motion. So what motivated me was the idea that trying to grab some nice images and paintings from famous painters and see how I could make those static images gain some motion. So on the presentation, I'll go over the whole process of how I went about to add some fluid dynamic to the painting, making use of the work that the amazing work that the artist already had put on it.
It's beautiful work. I'm looking forward to seeing the presentation. Let's jump in.
Cool, let's go.
In this presentation, I'll go over the process I used to create this type of scene. Back in 2018, I published a series of videos called Liquid Particles. One of them was particularly successful, and I've been asked many times to explain how I did it, so in this presentation I'm finally going to. I'll try to cover everything from the artistic drive and inspiration to the technical solutions I came up with to bring the idea to life. In Liquid Particles 2, I was exploring the idea of paintings in motion. So it's a clear case where the idea that artists steal definitely applies. Notice how I try to avoid the actual expression attributed to Pablo Picasso that says, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." But I think everyone involved in a creative activity will understand that we are inspired by other people's work, and whether you do it consciously or subconsciously, they provide you with the elements with which you build your own creative work, hoping that you might one day inspire others as well. So the first task was to choose a painting. Thanks to Google Arts and Culture, we have free access to some very high quality images of an amazing art collection, so be sure to check it out, and thanks Google. You might think it took me a while to decide, but to be honest, there were two that immediately came to mind, and between the two it wasn't hard to decide because one of them was just perfect for what I wanted to do. I considered The Scream by Edvard Munch, but The Starry Night by Van Gogh was just perfect. With this painting, I got two essential elements: a beautiful palette, which when you're doing something in the area of motion graphics is a particularly sensible topic, and the painting is so dynamic that it already had the motion painted into it, so it's perfect. Here is a great resource where you can find some gigapixel images to download. These resolutions are a bit overkill, but it's still a great resource to have. In my case, I downloaded a version with 4252 by 3367 pixels, and I also took note of the actual size of the painting, which in the case of The Starry Night is 921 millimeters width by 737 millimeters height. This information is also available on Google Arts. So download the high resolution version of the painting you chose, and we're off to Houdini to make some magic. Let's get started. So I just opened Houdini, created a new project and gave it a name. And now I'm going to create a geometry container called Starry Night. Dive inside and create a grid. We're going to create a grid with dimensions, the actual dimensions of the painting. So it was 921 millimeters by 737 millimeters. Okay, we'll control the resolution of our simulation with the grid. So I'll grab this value, copy parameter, base relative reference, and multiply by 1,000. And we'll add 1 to this. I'm going to copy this, paste, and just replace the Y by an X. And this will give us 738 rows and 922 columns. And we'll have a grid spacing of 1 millimeter. Okay. Let's create a controller. Let's create a null where we gather those main controls. And let's just add a multiplier for our resolution, and I'll say res mult. Apply, accept, let's start with 0.5, and we'll grab this parameter, copy parameter, and we'll multiply what we have here by that number times base relative references. And I'm going to grab this okay, so now we have half of it. If we have the resolution at 100%, then we will have that 1 millimeter grid. We need some UVs. Let's use a UV project. Initialize it. So now we do have some UVs, and we'll create an attribute from map. We'll choose the texture. Here on the initialize, you might need to flip the rotation to -90 to get the proper projection. Shift W so we don't see the wireframe, and I'll disable the grid. I'll also change the background to dark. Now, this is going to be our source plane, so I'll create a null out source plane. And from this point on, we just need the points. So let's create an add, and let's delete everything but the points. Notice how much detail we already have just by the density of our grid. And finally, we're gonna need the distance between these points. Of course, we already know it's 1 millimeter, but if we change the resolution with the controller, we want that to be automatically updated. So we'll save a detail attribute that gives us the distance between the points. And we'll just do that in a very quick and simple way. We'll create a detail attribute that's gonna grab the position from point 0 and grab the position from point 1, and we'll save the detail attribute called dist. It's going to be equal to the distance between point 0, point 1, and we should have that attribute here. Forgot to change this one. Okay, and this is the distance. So it's pretty close to 1 millimeter. Now that we have this, I'm gonna make it explicit to calculate distance. Now we're going to use the colors of each point to set some attributes that are going to be very important in controlling the behavior of the simulation. That's something that we can also use. You can grab the different colors that you see in each point and grab each one of the color channels, R, G, and B, and set those to control attributes like density, viscosity, etc. Just going to work with those two for now. So let's create a point for angle. And we'll call this set attributes. I'm going to use a vector of the white color. I'm going to call this vector white. It's going to be equal to 1 by 1 by 1. So this is going to be the maximum luminosity that we'll have on our image. And what I'm going to do is use the luminosity to control the density. The areas that are darker will be more dense than the areas that are brighter. And I'll need to have this as a reference. So I'll create a density attribute. It's going to be equal to the length of that white vector minus the length of the actual point color. If this were a value that goes from 0 to 1 and you wanted the complement, you would adjust to 1 minus the value. But since we're working with the length of a vector, we have to take that into account. So once we inverted the luminosity values, let's multiply this by a reasonable value for density, which is going to be around 1000. The next thing I want to do is make sure that the result of this never goes below a certain value. I want to make sure that the black pixels, or the points that have very low values of luminosity, don't get densities close to 0. So I'll use a clamp, and I'll clamp this value between 200 and something. Okay, so now if we check our point density values, we'll have maximum values of 1732 and minimum values of 200. And those should give us some nice reactions. Next, we'll work on the viscosity. And for that, I'm going to use the red channel of these points, of the color of these points. So I'll say the viscosity is going to be equal to the red channel times a certain maximum value that I'll establish for the viscosity. Finally, we'll set the mass to be equal to the distance attribute, so that if we decrease the resolution, the mass is going to increase. Let's just press the button to create the channel, and I'll set the maximum viscosity to be equal to 10. And let's check our attributes. I'm going to minimize this, don't really need it for now. So we have the density values, the mass values are all the same, and then we have our viscosity values. So we'll have values closer to 0 and values of viscosity closer to 10. And now these are our source points. Now, source points. So now we have our source points, but we're not going to be simulating just a single layer of this. We'll have several layers. So let's copy this, copy and transform, and we'll say we'll copy it 4 times. And the distance between each one of those layers is going to be equal to the distance attribute. So here on the translate, we'll grab the distance from the detail attribute. Okay, and that way we get a nice grid. If we decrease the resolution, let's say 0.5, then the spacing updates automatically, okay? So now that we have our source points, the next thing we need is going to be the velocities that are going to actually drive the motion of those points. For that, we're going to be using a velocity volume that we're going to be creating based on the features of the painting. The way we're going to be creating that velocity volume is going to be through the use of curves. But the way we're going to be painting those curves will require us to have the painting visible. And for that, I'm just going to hide this and create a Starry Night reference, dive inside, create a grid. Let's set it to the same dimensions. We don't need any divisions, actually. Let's set this to 2 and 2. And next, we're just going to apply UV quick shade. Let's make sure we have UVs first. Let's flip the rotation here and apply UV quick shade so that we can actually see the texture in the viewport. Okay, so now we have this as a reference object. Now if we go to our actual Starry Night points, we'll create the curves using a draw curve. Okay, we'll set the projection to happen on the ZX plane. We could use geometry, but we don't actually need it. This is already on the plane, so. And since we have this option to show the other objects as ghosts, we won't have any trouble drawing them. I'm going to hit spacebar 2 to go to the top view and actually draw the curves from this angle. Just hit enter and start drawing. Make sure that you create from the origin to the end. The direction in which you create the spline is actually going to be important. Let me try this one again. So we don't need too many. This will be enough. You can add a few more here and there. Let's see. Something like this, just to create more motion. You can add several ones here, for instance. And the next step is going to be for us to create a volume to generate the velocity volume. So I'll use a bound. And I'll grab the source points and I'll create this box around the source points. Next, I'll generate a volume from this, VDB from polys. It's going to be a density, fog volume. Let me hide the reference now. And as for the voxel size, I'm going to grab the detail attribute again. Okay, so we'll grab the detail from the source points. Let's say detail, out, source points, dist, and we'll multiply this by 4. We don't need to go too far on the resolution of the velocity volume, so this will be enough. And finally, we'll create a volume velocity from curves. Here we get the curves. And here we get the reference volume. Again, the voxel size, I'm going to use the same one as this one, so I'll just copy parameters, paste expressions, and we'll grab the same thing. Now let's have a look at what we have so far. Middle mouse button, and we have our velocity. So let's visualize that. Volume slice. Let's slice the volume. And let's do a volume trail. let's make sure to cut the slice on the ZX plane. This is what we have. Let me lower the resolution for a moment so that we can see this better. Probably even lower. Okay, so these are the motions that we have right now. We can, of course, control here the minimum radius curves in radius. So we don't need, if you lower this value, you're going to get less of a blend and more variation based on the features that we draw. We can set this to 1. We'll get even more crazy stuff going. And as for the radius multiplier, you'll have to give it a try. Yeah, I'll set this to 1. Okay, so we have some crazy, this will give us some nice, interesting motions. We have some collisions here and there. Notice that the direction with which we draw stuff is also very important. Now, this volume is already pretty interesting, but we can add a bit of disturbance. And for that, we'll just use a volume velocity, which allows us to add some curl noise. Okay, let's make sure we don't add too much. And with this, we have our velocity volume. So let's create a null here. I'll actually grab this one. Out val VDB. And we're all set. Now let's create our Dop network. Our first input is going to be the source particles, the initial points. Then we'll have as a second input, we'll have the velocity volume. Let's dive inside. So we're going to need a flip object, a flip solver, gravity, and we'll also need a volume source to get the velocity, and we'll connect it here to the volume velocity. Okay, let's start with the flip object. We'll set the input type to be particle field. The solve path is going to be, we're going to use the typical expression to grab the first input. And this should give us the path to the Starry Night's outsource points. Here on the guides, I'm going to go to particles and visualization as particles instead of sprites. And I'll say that the visualization type is going to be none, so that we can actually see the colors of the particles. Here on the particle separation, we'll also grab the detail. Okay, that'll give us the distance attribute that we calculated. And we'll do the simulation on closed boundaries. Everything activated. Let's say we want to initialize velocity and add viscosity attribute. On the source velocity, we want to do one operation based on a vector, and we're going to grab the val volume to apply to the val field. And we're going to be copying it. We can scale the values here. Let's start with 0.2. I know 1 is going to be too strong. We don't need to match any particular field, and we don't need anything else. Just need to tell it that the source volume for the velocity is going to be the second context geometry. On the flip solver, we're going to go to the volume motion and set the box size and box center, also based on the output particles. So here, let's say bbox out points, the x size, and we're gonna copy and paste on the other coordinates. And we'll do the same thing for the centroid. Just gonna grab this path and we'll say centroid, Control V, dx, Control C, Control V, dy, Control V, dz. Next, there are other things that we need to activate here. So on the viscosity, we need to enable it and tell it that it's going to be by attribute. Same thing for density. Here on the velocity transfer, it would make sense for us to actually switch to a swirly kernel so that we have more swirls. We don't need to smooth the surface. Let's go back to particle motion. And here there are two things that we can change. The reseeding is something that you might want to turn on or off depending on the effect that you want, but for this particular simulation, I'm going to turn it off. On the liquid particles 2 video, I actually had this turned on, and so it generates a different type of motions, but you will notice that some particles just appear out of thin air, even though they do follow a certain logic of motion. But on this simulation, I just want to reuse the same particles. I don't want to be reseeding them. On the separation tab, I'm going to make sure to apply some particle separation just so they don't overlap each other. And that's basically it. Now, all we need to do is press play and watch the simulation happen. As you can see, it's already taking place. I'll stop the simulation now, and here on the volume motion, you can actually go to the solver, and if you have a nice graphics card, you can use OpenCL. It will make things a lot faster. And the other thing is, for the sake of just previewing this, I might even go as low as 0.4 or maybe 0.25%, just so that we can actually see this faster. I'm also going to create a Dop import so we can bring this in. I just want to grab the flip object. Fetch geometry from Dop Network. This should be pretty fast. But it's good for us to have an idea about the scale of the speed of the velocity volume. Of course, the effect tends to be very different if you're working with high resolution or low resolution. But yeah, it's happening, and this is the effect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back to 1. And I'm also going to create a file cache to cache the simulation. And I'll be right back. Once the simulation is done, I'll be back to show you the result. Here is a high resolution simulation of this effect. You get some really nice movements, really interesting shapes forming, very relaxing type of motion happening. For this preview, I did change the visualization of the particles to pixels, because we have such a high density of particles that if you keep it as points, then they just give you some weird effects on the preview. So as you can see, this is a pretty simple setup to create a very interesting effect, and you can apply the same logic to whatever painting you desire or you prefer, and this will give you a lot of cool renders to choose from. Now let's see how we can how I rendered this out. So for rendering, I didn't went with Mantra for the sake of speed. I do have a laptop which has 2 GPUs, so my natural choice would be Redshift, and that's what I did. We do need to set up some attributes for the points, mainly just the P scale. So let's create a point wrangle and take care of that. Let's set a P scale value. You could base it on the distance, but I figured that it was just a parameter, so you can tweak it manually. So I'm gonna just do it like this. We'll keep the color of the points. I'll call this set P scale, and that's it. I'll also create a null out particles render. Let's make sure that this always renders out. So going up, I'll hide this Starry Night reference. I will use an HDRI to light this. It's an HDRI that I got from HDRI Haven. Let me expand this. I'll be using this HDRI from HDRI Haven to light the particles. It has a nice warm tone, and I like the light direction for this particular case. I tend to use this HDRI very often to visualize models and stuff like that. So I'm gonna go here to the Redshift tab, and I'll just create a light dome. I'll select that HDRI. Let's choose an area, an interesting area for placing the camera. On this whole setup, it's probably where I spend more time, was choosing an angle or a camera position to decide what to render. This works very well when you have a big piece of it, but you can also get some very interesting results doing things more on a macro style, where you have some nice depth of field to the render. So I might go with that. Let's see what this angle gives us. We have a lot of motion here. So I'm gonna hold Control and click on the camera. Yeah, we have some nice motion here. Now, on the camera, I'm gonna make sure to render this at full HD. And the other thing I wanna make sure is that the focus distance here on the sampling, the focus distance, let me hit enter, and let's adjust it on the viewport. So that's not a bad distance. Let's see what that gives us on the render. And what else? So we have the light, we have the camera. Let's go to the output, create a redshift render. So now on the redshift, so just make sure to copy this here. And on the redshift, or better yet, on the camera, don't forget to go to the redshift and turn on depth of field. So we have our camera, our light, we have the redshift ROP. On our object, we need to go to redshift tab and tell it to render the object as particles. And we also need material. So let's go to the material section, create an RS material builder. Let's apply this to the particles. Dive inside, and here on the material, we'll just load the point attribute. It's going to be the color of the particles, and let's connect it to the color. Everything else here, I'm going to leave the reflection weight at 0, and let's see what this gives us. Go to the render view. I'll disable the progressive, hit render. Let's check out what we have. So the particles are very big. The focus is I think we have a good focus. For now, I'm going to override the camera resolution here. Okay, let's change the scale of the particles. Let's go here to the set P scale. 1. This is the actual size that we had, or the distance between the particles. Let's put half of this, and that should give us a good size. Okay, let's turn this back to the full resolution. As you can see, they're nicely packed. And this size actually makes sense. I'm going to increase the intensity of the light dome a bit, say 1.5. Yeah. I also want a bit more. I want the field. I also want a bit less depth of field effect. So on the camera, just go to sampling, and on the f-stop, just pull that up. By adjusting the f-stop, you can control the amount of depth of field effect that you get. The lower the f, the more intense the effect. So if we go to 1.2 or something like that, we get a very narrow focus region. But if you go to 16, you get a much wider focus region. I think something in between, like 8, is going to be good enough. You can, of course, work on the focus distance, maybe push it a bit more away, 0.24. It's more on the middle. And you can, of course, animate these values, but this will give us some nice motion, I guess. When you're going to render this out with the final quality, the settings that I was using was mostly, let me just disable the progressive rendering for the preview. I was using here higher settings on maximum samples mostly because of the depth of field. To get rid of this graininess, you need to go up to 256. That should help get rid of most of the noise, and it's still pretty fast. So this is the complete setup. So let's review what we've done. Basically, I just have one grid, some UVs, color from texture. We get the points, calculate the distance between those points to control a lot of the other things happening. We set the attributes based on the color as well. So we're using the luminance of each point to control the density. We're using the red channel of each point to control the viscosity. And we're defining the mass based on the distance between the particles. So because if we change resolution, the mass of each point should increase as well. Then we're creating several layers, copies, with the distance between them matching the distance between particles. And these are our source points. These will be our initial particles that we'll be applying to the flip. Then from this we create a volume where we just draw some curves over the painting, following the motion on the painting in order to generate this velocity field that's going to be driving the particles. We bring these two things into a Dop network where we have the flip object set to initial data to particle field, grabbing the first input, close boundaries, particle separation based on the distance between the particles. We grab the second input as a source velocity. Nothing fancy here, just copying the values and using a value for the scale, 0.2 in this case. The flip solver, we set the volume limits based on the bounding box of the output particles, of the particles that we're using for the initial particles. And we grab the center from that, and we grab the size. We also make sure to enable viscosity based on attribute, density also based on attribute. And on the solver, I just changed to OpenCL because it can help. Disable the smooth surface, turned on the swirly kernel for velocity transfer. On the particle motion, I just disabled the reseeding and apply the particle separation. Didn't change anything on the sub steps, added some gravity, and that's it. Then you just cache what you have, and then when it's cached, you can load it back, apply the p-scale before sending things out to render. The render setup is pretty straightforward as well, so I just have a light dome using an HDRI Haven HDRI and using a camera with depth of field settings set up, so focus distance, small focus distance, an f of 8, redshift with enabled off setup, and that's it.